Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 48th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I, at News from Neptune, will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. No's notes are posted on the blog newsfromneptune.com. And bearing in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. On a Trump is not the problem edition of News from Neptune. This arises from a discussion this week about the monthly demonstration carried on by the local anti-war group AWARE. At the demonstration tomorrow, the demonstration is regularly the first Saturday of the month, from 2 to 4 p.m. In downtown Champaign, corner of Main and Neal Streets. At tomorrow's demonstration, a flyer will be distributed with the title, "President Trump is not the problem. Illegal U.S. wars around the world are." The U.S. government is today making war around the world and is doing so without authorization from the U.S. Constitution or the UN Charter. If American leaders were put on trial today, as German leaders were at Nuremberg after World War II for launching aggressive war, they, like the German leaders, would be hanged. The U.S. military is today killing people in 7 Mideast and African countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, and on the other side of the world, in the Philippines. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these countries, although most Americans don't know that. In addition, the 70,000-member U.S. Special Operations Command is active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, rendition, torture, and murder. President Obama was elected as an anti-war candidate, but in office he sent thousands of additional U.S. troops into America's longest war in Afghanistan. President Trump, who promised caution and non-intervention in foreign policy and described Hillary Clinton as a trigger-happy warmonger, has now done the same thing himself as Obama. What both men knew is that in spite of intense media propaganda, most Americans don't want U.S. troops engaged in foreign wars and don't see the killing as justified. Both candidates had to seem to oppose the wars in order to get elected. But the 1%, the U.S. economic elite, do want the wars. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the least damaged major country on either side and controlled the world economy. America's wars since then, in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, and the Mideast, have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the purpose of maintaining that control. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. John Pilger wrote before the election, "The CIA has demanded Trump is not elected. Pentagon generals have demanded that he is not elected. The pro-war New York Times, taking a breather from its relentless low-rent Putin smears, demands that he is not elected. Something is up. These tribunes of perpetual war are terrified that the multi-billion-dollar business of war, by which the United States maintains its dominance, will be undermined if Trump does a deal with Putin and then with China's Xi Jinping. Their panic at the possibility of the world's great power talking peace, however unlikely, would be the blackest farce with issues not so dire." Close quote. We must demand that foreign military bases be closed, U.S. troops and weapons be brought home, and social support, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income, be provided for Americans immiserated by generations of U.S. government wars. That's the flyer that will be distributed at the anti-war group's down Champaign demonstration tomorrow. The rest of the flyer includes the addresses of our local congressional representatives, Representative Davis and Senators Duckworth and Durbin, with suggestions that they be sent reminders about the importance of these issues and the need to reverse the war policy that the U.S. has been following in all recent administrations, and apparently now in this one as well. David, over to you. Comments? You're watching News from Neptune. We are talking about the war policy of the United States, and it's David's turn.
Well, I wouldn't take issue with most of what you said. My issue that we've discussed over the last few days in long, elaborate threads on our aware list, which has gone off in all kinds of tangents, bringing in all kinds of people we haven't heard from in some time. My exception has to do with the emphasis on Trump's agency as opposed to Obama's agency. And as I said in my note on that list, it's understandable when Obama came into office, the narrative was that he wanted to do this, he wanted to do that, but the institutions and the Congress and so forth didn't let him be the peace candidate. They didn't let him be the labor candidate. And this was not true. It was clear after he was elected, or even before he was elected, but certainly in the interim period after he was elected and before he came into office, that he was going to do Wall Street's bidding and he was going to do the Pentagon's bidding. It was more clear all along that he was going to continue to do the Pentagon's bidding. And his agency is involved in that. Trump, being the rather aimless and reckless rhetorician that he is, said all kinds of things, including the things you refer to. And it may, given that he was a genuinely maverick candidate in a way that Obama wasn't, it might have given us some hope. And it's understandable that just as we would want to compensate for the fact that to our mostly liberal audience, that Obama was responsible for what was going on, that we would also want to compensate for the idea that Trump is the problem with everything and that all we have to do is oppose Trump. That I understand. I understand the compensatory aspects of both of those views. Still, it's jarring to me, or the contrast is sharp to me, that for all these years it's been Obama, 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 and now after 1 year of Trump, it's not yet Trump. It's still the forces surrounding Trump that are persuading him to do this and forcing him to do that and making him impossible to do this or that. Whereas Trump is an agent, a free agent, quote unquote, every bit as much as Obama is or was, or any president is or could be. And so the question becomes, how do we put that across in ways that, yes, explains the institutional basis for Trump's presidency, maybe retroactively explains the institutional basis for every president before him, including Obama, including Kennedy, whose agency is also regularly asserted in a certain way that we talk about. And so, how do we communicate with our fellow citizens that we must oppose Trump's policies, which ultimately he's the president, He's the dude. He's responsible for deciding who gets to be Secretary of State, who gets to be Chief of Staff, who whether we go to war. And these are not idle concerns, given this morning, for instance, I watched an interview just produced yesterday, interview with a person who's been mentioned often on this program, Trita Parsi, on the Real News Network, talking about the possibilities of a Secretary of State Pompeo and a CIA Director Tom Cotton,
right.
what the ramifications of that might be for going to war with Iran, which supposedly, Trump is being, actively, passively involved in all of this. And I think that the confusion among the liberal class regarding these issues is pretty amply demonstrated in the New York Times editorial this morning, the unsigned editorial, the editorial board editorial, about this issue of who's going to be Secretary of State and so forth, because they're still playing diplomats. They're still playing. We need the ship of state to right itself, and we need the diplomats in the Department of State to be the adults in the room and all that. Meanwhile, Trump is in some ways coming back to the comfort level that they're used to in leaders who maintain a high degree of tension between U.S. interests and the interests of other countries. So that's a mouthful, and I know I was meandering a little bit. So that's all it is. If it was about Obama for 8 years, it's about Trump now. And if it wasn't about Obama for 8 years and Bush for 8 years before that, then it's not about Trump now.
And what I'm saying is that the issue is always the policy that the United States is following around the world, particularly in regard to war. When we talk about American foreign policy and war in the world, we must always remember Martin Luther King's observation during Vietnam, that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is the United States. That was true then, it was true 50 years ago, and it's true today. As it were, abstract, the far less important historical question, how are these policies decided upon in different administrations, and whose writ runs at any given point, is a far less important issue. The inner workings of the Obama administration, the inner workings of the Trump administration are not particularly important when the conclusions are what we've come to know and love so well: America making war around the world. Now, it may be interesting to talk about how that happens, and it becomes interesting recently only because that Trump scared the war party, that congeries of American political groups who want the wars to continue and have wanted the wars to continue for literally for generations since the Second World War. Trump scared them. It took people like Robert Kagan, who was a perfectly good Republican neocon, one of the most outspoken of the Republican neocons, people saying that, well, of course we have to kill people around the world in order to make the world safe for American capitalism. They drove him out of the Republican Party and into the Clinton campaign because Clinton was a reliable warmonger, and it looked like the erratic Trump was not a reliable warmonger. That's the only feature of interest in this whole matter. Now, the second act, or the second step in this, is that in office, Trump has been tamed, if that's the right word, to the standard warmongering of the Obama administration, of the Bush administration, of the first Clinton administration, assuming there might be another. It becomes far less interesting what the views of the presidential candidate or even of the sitting president actually are. It is instructive that Trump's animadversions to the wars that the Obama administration was carrying on should have such an effect. And mainly what it does is allow the war party, or allows us to see what the war party does all along and has done all along. That's why I titled this particular flyer, Trump is not the problem, illegal U.S. wars around the world are. And for all our discussion about how those wars have been decided upon and forwarded by this administration or the last one, the actual process remains the same. The wars go on. The 8 wars that the Obama administration is engaged in are all now still on the agenda and are being engaged in by the Trump administration. So what we should be talking about is the wars and how they can be stopped, not the peculiarities of the souls of or the personalities of recent presidents. Who wants to talk about the personalities of recent presidents? The Clinton campaign, the War Party, wants us to abominate the personality of the present president in order to make sure that he doesn't depart from these from the traditional war making of modern American administrations. The particular case you mentioned, the case of the Secretary of State Tillerson, points up what's going on here. Tillerson is the member of the Trump cabinet who is most clearly identified with that tendency of Trump on the stump to say we have to do a deal with Putin. I wrote a book on the art of the deal, and I can do a deal with President Xi of China. This is what horrified the War Party, and this is the sort of thing that Tillerson is sort of the last man standing of holding on to that notion. People suggest that he has a good reason for doing that. As a ExxonMobil executive, he certainly wants not war, but cooperation with the world's largest oil producer, that is Russia. But the attempt to replace him with this mad congressman from the Midwest, there are a lot of mad congressmen in the Midwest, I admit, in order to get the war with Iran going, is particularly shocking, because Tillerson, as I say, is what's left over of the Trump remarks during the campaign about making deals. Tillerson supports the deal with Iran, and Pompeo clearly doesn't. If the war with Iran takes place, it has to be in opposition to that line in the Trump campaign that talked about making deals. And Tillerson is the man standing for it, and according to the morning paper, as you say, he looks like being out of a job. I think that we may hear more about that, but that's also to argue that Obama was going against the War Party when he made the Iran deal in the first place, and he certainly was. And that War Party in that case was more the Republican than the Democratic Party. Not that I don't view the Democratic Party establishment as the War Party, but the shoe is on the other foot. So if you're going to analyze Trump in relation to Iran in this context, then you have to also acknowledge Obama in relation to Iran and the War Party. In that context, although clearly Obama was more politically shrewd and probably more aware of what the processes were, whereas Trump, who knows what he knows, who knows what he's aware of, who knows what his thought process is. And I'm not saying it's important, but if it's good for the goose, the gander, etc. Obama and Trump find themselves, ironically, given their contrasts in style,
find themselves in the same boat. If you want to argue that Trump is in that boat, then Obama, wanted peace in the Middle East too.
Well, I think there is.
And Trump doesn't want peace, and that's his obviously his weakest area. There was never anything about his campaign rhetoric that indicated beyond Russia and China that he wanted any kind of drastic change of course in U.S. policy in the Middle East.
Actually, there's an interesting example of that in the Trump campaign. Trump caused great horror among the usual neocons and particularly amongst supporters of Israel early on in the campaign, who said, we have got to get away from a Middle East policy dominated by Israel. We need an even-handed policy in the Middle East. Well, you can imagine the outrage that caused. And it was so great that one of the first major attempts to put the lid on Trump, to get him back with the program, occurred after that. And by the end of the campaign, Trump was saying, oh, of course, by the way, we probably should move the American embassy to Jerusalem and make that in the campaign, he turned from the let's make a deal in the Middle East. The make a deal line was the principal foreign policy suggestion that Trump had in the campaign. He moved from that to the standard U.S. position in regard to Israel that he holds now. It was a straw in the wind, a fairly big straw, I have to admit, a straw in the wind about how the frightening non-neocon vision of Donald Trump would change and would be under pressure to change. It did.
So, okay, and Barack Obama had his picture taken with Edward Said or Rashid Khalidi, or I forget which one it was, but there's a famous picture about him that
Khalidi, I think, yeah.
Yeah, Khalidi, right, okay.
In Chicago.
Yeah, right, and then
early on, right.
Then there was the old Jeremiah Wright thing, and yes, he went through his trial by fires there. In retrospect, you couldn't doubt for a moment that that Obama was going to sell out the Palestinian people in terms of however, not they were ever sold in, and the implication that Trump's views were based on some kind of principles, and that he was going to follow through on these.
Who's saying that?
Well, who's saying it about
what
Obama?
What he said frightened the neocons.
Yeah.
And he did that several times.
So just consider that his sort of Jeremiah Wright moment. And
why do we care? Why do we care about the personalities of these presidents? What we should care about is the policy followed by the American government. The only reason to talk about what Trump said in the campaign was to note the effect it had on the war policy, on the war party that had dominated presidential politics for 40 years. So they were scared of him. There was no question about that. And they moved heaven and earth to make sure that he'd get with the program, at which he has largely done. So the only reason we should pay attention to the inner heart of presidential candidates is to note the effect that it has on the forces actually determining American policy around them. The answer is that American policy hasn't changed. The American policy is remarkably continuous. I think that's even true on Iran. The argument about Iran, the Iran deal, as I said, has always been a Potemkin village from the beginning. That is to say, it's something that it wants to seem to be something which it's not. There is a tactical difference between various groups in regard to Iran as to whether the Iran deal is a good idea. But the goal of the Iran deal is exactly the goal that the United States has had in the Mideast for literally generations. That is to control Middle Eastern oil flows, Middle Eastern energy resources. The agreement but that the Obama administration worked out with Iran had little to do with nuclear weapons. Everyone knew that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and if it did, it would do it only for defensive purposes when Israel has 200 nuclear weapons and the U.S. has a monopoly of nuclear weapons in the region. So the defensive Iranian bomb, which was a fantasy from the beginning, was never the real object of American policy. The real object of American policy in every administration since 1979 has been to reincorporate Iran into the overall framework of order, as Henry Kissinger called it, that meant that the U.S. had control over the energy that moved out of the Middle East. The Obama administration thought that you could catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, and therefore tried to use honey, that is, an agreement with Iran that would ease some of the sanctions against Iran, in order to restore the American control over Iranian oil arrangements from the Middle East, Iranian oil exports from the Middle East, as the U.S. was trying to use the worldwide oil market for its purposes against its enemies, notably Russia and Venezuela. If it had no control over Iranian oil, then its long-term strategy of controlling Middle East oil energy flows didn't work. The Obama administration thought that they could do that with an agreement, and the saber rattlers who said, no, we've got to bomb Iran in order to control their oil exports, were revealed as impractical. That's not a real difference in policy. What does make a real difference in policy is the ever closer relationships between Iran and Russia. And this is the real concern of Washington right now, the fact that any move against Iran is going to be a move against Russia as well. This is a conclusion from the Syrian war, and this fits in with American policy, the policy of war provocations against Russia, which the Obama administration was down with from the beginning. Were particularly vigorous about. In Obama's usual style, he didn't talk about it too openly, but in fact, the Obama administration was more belligerent vis-a-vis Russia than even the previous administration was, notably in Ukraine, but also in Eastern Europe across the way. What I'm trying to suggest is that the differences on Iran, although was blown up into an ideological point in the campaign, were always really tactical, because the American strategic goals remained the same, and Iran was understood in that context.
So yeah, and all I was arguing was let's cut Obama a break too, if he was just you're not, because you're cutting Trump a break. That's why.
I don't want to cut either one of them a break. I want to understand what the U.S. is doing.
We need to make that clear.
What the policy? I have no reason.
One other contrast I would point out, for instance, is that in their policies towards Israel-Palestine, one can argue, based on Josh Rubner's account in the book Shattered Hopes, that Trump made a halfway serious effort to actually bring about a more lasting settlement between Israel and Palestine, which was there was very little hope for, which was undermined pretty easily with George Mitchell, being the envoy involved in it.
You said Trump did this.
I mean, Obama did
right,
this.
right.
I'm sorry if I said that. Yeah, and so so one could give Obama his little bit of Trumpian credit for saying some stuff and doing some stuff that didn't work out, and because it didn't work out in the broader context of our relationship with Israel and the Arab Spring and everything that was going on at that time, there just wasn't going to be peace in the Middle East in relation in that part of the Middle East in relation to Israel's importance as a U.S. ally for other reasons. So there you go. There's a little something, and fine. I don't like either of them. I don't like them for different reasons, or I don't like them for the same reason. That is, they want power. They gained a lot of power by explicitly or implicitly assuring the ruling class that they would do their bidding. Trump perhaps less so, but look what's going on. We've got the tax bill. We've got this onslaught in foreign policy. It's a little scary. So I guess we have to make our peace with the fact that Trump, there was, it's hard to say in retrospect, there was little chance that he would be able to seriously buck the establishment, and he certainly didn't have the doesn't have the sort of intellectual and political tools for doing so.
The concentration on Trump's personality and what he really thinks and whether he really thinks, I mean, this is nonsense. What we're concerned about is what the United States is doing around the world, and by the United States we mean the congeries of political forces in Washington that actually sends bombers and kills people around the world. What the U.S. is actually doing is far more important than what Barack Obama thinks or what Donald Trump thinks, which we know only by implication anyhow. But there are people who want us to concentrate on Trump's personality. I don't think we should do it. The concentration on Trump's personality is the strategy of the pro-war party. And by the pro-war party, I mean the Pentagon, the intelligence community, the Clinton campaign, the neocons. It says to concentrate on Trump's personality is their strategy to force the government to continue the wars and war provocation of the last administration. They think either Trump can be forced to fall in line with that war policy, as he's shown he's willing to do, under the threat of Russiagate, or be replaced with Pence, a war party creature, or any others you happen to have around. There are plenty to choose from. And as I say, I think this morning's news about Tillerson and having driven the last remaining deal maker out of the Trump administration shows how that works. The anti-war movement should insist that Trump, who is in many ways the weakest president since Calvin Coolidge, the major difference between Coolidge and Trump is that Coolidge was known as Silent Cal because he never said anything, and Trump has taken another route in that regard.
They didn't have Twitter back then.
Well, there we are. Maybe Cal would have gone mad with his morning Twitter, perhaps. But in any case, in terms of actual effect, Calvin Coolidge got 3 of the major New York bankers and put them in charge of the government in the 1920s. And one of the reasons we had some economic embarrassment in the 1930s. But Trump, in a remarkably parallel way, has taken 3 generals and put them in charge of the government. So what Coolidge did with the economy, the heyday of American capitalism in the 20s, the present administration has done with war. Put 3 generals in charge. But in each case, the president, Coolidge, Trump, is remarkably weak, and has turned over control to the capitalist party in the 20s and the war party in today. The continuing Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump war policy is what has to be resisted. And the war party is using Trump in a way as a distraction from that policy. They're Trump to say, well, Trump is really a secret agent of Moscow, and therefore we've got to get our war back on and make sure that the secret agents from Moscow don't sap our vital bodily fluids that lead us to war in East and West. We should not be talking about presidential personality in that regard. We should be opposing the Pentagon, the CIA, the deep state from the Obama administration, the neocons, who are promoting these war provocations against Russia and China, not bothering too much with the Potemkin president that we have before us.
That's never been my my style on this program. Or
Not
my
your
other
style,
public-
but it is certainly style of people in the in the
Yeah.
discussion right now.
Yeah, and it wasn't my style in relation, largely, even though Obama, I had my sharp words for him, I wasn't, it became pretty clear that Obama was simply operating in the Democratic Party neoliberal, neoconservative style.
Exactly.
And that was clear when he appointed Hillary Clinton to be Secretary of State and so on and so forth. So, yeah. Well, maybe we can go on to something else.
I have,
if there is something else.
The historian Perry Anderson, who was for a long time editor of the New Left Review and has written some of the most interesting, I think, historical sociology, you might say, about the coming of capitalism in the modern world, wrote a piece a while ago in which he says as follows: American centrism, and by American centrism he means the Obama-Clinton foreign and domestic policy, understood as center in that it's not a left policy, obviously, nor is it a specifically right policy. So American centrism, which is the term for what all recent administrations have followed in foreign and domestic policy, what we have summarized as neoliberalism and neoconservatism. American centrism, he says, is far from its deathbed. He's responding to some arguments and saying that what the Trump and Sanders campaign and the rise of populism and so forth shows is this American consensus, this American centrism that has guided American administrations for 40 years is coming to an end. No, says Anderson, it's not. To believe otherwise, it says it's far from its deathbed. To believe otherwise is to prolong its lifespan even further. That is to say, oh yes, we've got to shore up American centrism because it's under such attack. We've got to get back to those happy days of Bill Clinton and George Bush when America was respected in the world and we could kill people with aplomb. There's no hint of exhaustion in the ferocity of its siege of Trump. And that's really what we've been talking about today, this concentration on Trump's personality because he threatens to go off the reservation. There's no hint of exhaustion in the ferocity of its siege of Trump, and little probability that the legacy it is busy consecrating will have anything to do, even inadvertently, with a vigorous radicalism, that is the practice of recent administrations, will have nothing to do, even inadvertently, with a vigorous radicalism, rather than perpetuating a devout conformism. That's that's what we're looking at. In such conditions, a clean break is required with celebrity culture and its fixation on the alternative political incarnations of it. By celebrity culture means precisely this talk about Obama, Trump, Clinton, their personalities, their peccadillos, their whatever, that we've been engaging in all morning. Writing before the election, Benjamin Kunkel, and I haven't mentioned Benjamin Kunkel recently, he's one of the most interesting young political writers in the U.S. right now, I think. Writing before the election, Benjamin Kunkel observed of Clinton's outlook, Trump himself became the national emergency, rather than the stagnation, inequality, and perceived decline that made Trump and Bernie plausible candidates in the first place. And we might say after the fact that it finally elected Trump. And the same is true, even more so, today, says Anderson. I think that's right. And I think that it shows sort of cui bono whose interests are served by this concentration on Trump's personality. We have serious political questions to talk about, both foreign and domestic in the United States, and that's indeed where our attention should go.
So I have a serious question.
Okay.
I watched an event from New York City that was live streamed on Facebook this past, I guess it was Tuesday evening, from the New School. And it was a panel a panel discussion about anti-Semitism in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Not so much anti-Semitism on the left, of course, but anti-Semitism on the right. This panel was sponsored by Jacobin, the socialist quarterly magazine and blog site, and by Jewish Voice for Peace, the supposedly, and I would argue to some extent, leftist version of the Jewish pro-Palestinian movement that I subscribe to and which I throw a few dollars at, and as I do Jacobin. So this event, which was sponsored by two people who get a little bit of my money and some of my support for the last few years, and hosted by Amy Goodman, who gets none of my money and very little of my support for the last few years. And
get your act together, Amy.
Included 4 panelists besides Amy, and who didn't really speak, but just to introduce the other panelists, representing various aspects, 3 which represented various aspects of Jewish dissident movement in regard to Israel and Palestine. One of them was purportedly from a kind of a Sephardic perspective. It's hard to explain what that might be in this context, not worth it. But a rather articulate person. And then a couple other people, one of whom, Rebecca Vilkomerson, is the head of Jewish Voice for Peace, talking about the ins and outs of how we deal with anti-Semitism in the Trump era, especially from the alt-right, and how we deal with the customary accusations of anti-Semitism for the pro-Palestine movement. The 4th panelist, the only one who wasn't Jewish, was a woman named Linda Sarsour, who's gained a lot of notoriety and prominence as part of the sort of the up-and-coming Bernie movement, the intersectional movement, the anti-Trump movement. She was one of the sponsors of the Women's March on Washington the day after Trump became president, and someone who I've had a jaundiced eye on for quite some time now, and nothing about this event persuaded me that I shouldn't continue to keep a jaundiced eye on her, because she is a person of Palestinian American background who trades on her identity as a person of Palestinian background, and who kind of revels in the criticism and accusations of anti-Semitism that she has gotten without ever really being a part, as far as I can tell, of a real movement for justice in Palestine, except as part of the sort of intersectional array of movements that she participates in the context of Brooklyn and New York City at large. A very problematic event, a few things that I liked about it, but mostly problematic, mostly boring, mostly too much verbiage, and mostly too much of a cult-like atmosphere, what I would consider a cult-like atmosphere in terms of the people there and the audience's response to what was said. I mean, I understand people go out for the evening, they go to hear people that they sort of agree with, kind of learn something, they go to rouse the troops. There's a lot of laughter at jokes that are really not all that funny, and all the kind of things that go on at events like this that I've grown quite tired of over the many years that I have attended or observed events like this, which is why you would have never found me in that audience, even if I lived a block away and they paid me to go. I would not have been there, but I did want to watch it because I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, see what was being said, and not a whole lot was being said, especially about the problem is Israel and Palestine. And to get to the point here, Carl, and you know what's coming, because I've said this before, I don't understand why Jewish Voice for Peace in particular is so focused on anti-Semitism coming from any quarter, which I don't think is a particular problem in this country, to any political effect, to any effect that either affects Jewish people or the political process at large. Why are we talking about that? I guess this is similar to you not wanting to talk about Trump and who Trump is. I don't want to talk about anti-Semitism. Okay, everybody wants to talk about it. I don't. I think we should be talking about Israel-Palestine. And to sort of capture my point, it's the same thing we've been talking about for the last 10 years or longer on these programs. Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein have always argued over this period of time that we have to accept two states as a logical outcome of what international law dictates and what international diplomacy dictates at this time. And the BDS movement, which is a big part of this cult-like atmosphere that Norman Finkelstein talks about, is part of the problem in the sense that I don't see anything happening. Everybody thinks that something's happening. I don't see anything happening. All I see is this cult-like atmosphere. And in the wake of Trump, I see people no longer even talking about Israel-Palestine. I no longer see they had students for justice in Palestine on this campus invited a guy I like very much, Brent Rosen, a few weeks ago to speak on anti-Semitism. I didn't go because I didn't want to go to a speech on another talk on where people sit around talking about, well, anti-Semitism is this, anti-Semitism is that, and we've got to be concerned about it, but it really is, you don't accuse the wrong people. I think we should be moving beyond that. And moving beyond that means focusing on what's going on in Israel and Palestine and on what movement there is in regards to Israel and Palestine. But when you have a tactic with no strategy, when you have a tactic, mainly the boycott movement, with no goal, which doesn't commit to a two-state or one-state, but just kind of leaves it open and hanging there, then nothing's happening. Nothing's happening. And so, unfortunately, I have to sit down and write. I have to watch this again, and then sit down and probably write something to get it off my chest about what has gone wrong with particularly Jewish Voice for Peace in focusing solely on Trump and the alt-right and no longer on Israel and Palestine. It's the darndest thing.
This is important, obviously, and I hope you get that written and get it before read us a draft of it next week.
A perfectly good Sunday is gonna. I'm gonna fear is gonna go by the wayside.
I know the feeling. Let me mention two rather unlikely people who have some bearing on the situations you just described. I was astonished last night to see the Petroleum Broadcast System give their evening news, PBS Evening News Hour, give almost half the program to Ehud Barak.
Whoa.
What's going on here?
Gosh, I didn't hear about that.
Well, yeah, it's worth. I think you could. A lot of these things are archived, and you can pull.
Oh, sure. No, I'm sure.
My suspicion, and it's not much more than that.
Well, first, perhaps explain for people who might have forgotten this now relatively obscure figure who he is.
A long time Israeli political figure
Prime Minister
who has recently emerged as a challenger and alternative to Bibi Netanyahu, the president embattled, and I'm using that word correctly, by the way. People don't normally use it correctly. They use it to mean besieged. Embattled means armed and ready to fight. The embattled prime minister of Israel, who is in fact besieged both on personal peculation and the political stance that he is snake-hipping his way around in regard to Iran and and Lebanon particularly. So Barak has suddenly emerged as clearly an alternative to Netanyahu and was being presented as such by America's official broadcasting system last night. Now, what's going on? The problem is it can't be decided, I think, in isolation, just in terms of internal Israeli politics, because there's a second person that I want to mention here who has some bearing on it. That's MBS. Mohammed bin Salman, the new effective control the effective dictator of Saudi Arabia, all but dictator, working hard to establish himself as dictator, and indeed perhaps as king. He is crown prince right now, that is the heir to the present king. The present king is mad as a hatter, and there are constant reports that he is going to leave the job, and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, will become king at the age of 33 or 4, I think. In any case, the point here is not just that we have this particularly nasty piece of work rising to control of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel are effectively in alliance right now on the important political questions of war in the Middle East. And the Saudi-Israeli alliance changes things for everyone from the Palestinians to the Iranians. And in order to sort out this transformation that's going on without too much reporting in the American media, takes some effort. There's a lot of banging around behind the curtain, a lot of scenery being moved, a lot of people being put in position, a lot of other people being taken out of position, including at least one report that the richest member of Mohammed bin Salman's family is imprisoned and is being hanged upside down and beaten by members of Blackwater because he has so much money. I'm not making that up. It sounds like it, but that's the report that's coming from the activities of MBS in Saudi Arabia and with, for our purposes, reference to the activities of Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. So it's a particularly murky situation, but it's undergoing changes now of a sort we haven't seen in the Middle East in many a day. So I can imagine that your panel was confused the other day. Other people are involved in this. Hamas, the religious group established by Israel many years ago in order to undercut the secular Palestine Liberation Organization, is suddenly changing its position vis-a-vis the Israeli government, and the possibilities of a sort of general changing of partners in the Middle East, all in pursuit of the policy objectives that the United States has been after for many a day, seems to be what's going on right now. But you can't tell the players without a program, and I don't think we've got a program yet.
No, it's hard. Are you implying that the Palestinians are going to cut a deal, or the Palestinian leadership anyway, a more unified Palestinian leadership between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, is going to sort of try to cut a deal, whatever the Palestinian people want, is going to try to cut a deal which sort of gets Israel over the hump in terms of its alliance with the Saudis, and sort of be a part of this alignment, that the Palestinians are going to be a part of this. They're going to get something thrown at them to pacify them enough to go along with the flow and sort of become on the other side, so to speak, in the middle, on the other side, apart from this corridor between Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and so forth.
Apparently, that's not unthinkable.
Yeah.
I mean, we're accustomed to talk about the Middle East in terms of Arab versus Israeli.
Of course. Well, that's not been true forever now.
It's not been true for, and suddenly it's not true at all these days, as the principal Arab power, Saudi Arabia, is in alliance with Israel. And what we have is a more, apparently, fundamental alliance structure in the Middle East. The conflict not between Arab and Israeli, but between Sunni and Shia. Once again, these are political terms, not necessarily religious terms. It's not really an argument about verses of the Quran. It is an argument about political alliances. And the surprise is that the Sunni alliance includes Israel. And their opponents are the Shia alliance with Iran, with Russia and China standing behind it as the principal element in the Shia alliance.
Yeah, and all of this just makes it very difficult within Palestine, within the West Bank and Gaza itself, for people to organize in relationship to their own leadership to any political ends. And of course, it makes it easier for people in this country who whether Jewish or otherwise, who identify with the Palestinian cause, especially the kind of people who would attend this event the other night, to actually think in terms of what's going on there and what the political situation is and what the ends of organizing in this country, and especially my primary interest, which would be organizing within the Jewish community, which in some ways is ready to be organized, and these opportunities are being lost. Partly because of the confusion in the Middle East of which we speak, but also because it's just so much easier. It's easier to talk about anti-Semitism. It's easier to talk about intersectionality. It's easier to talk about people organizing in Brooklyn than it is for people to talk to basic liberal Jews who understand more and more what's going on and would like to see an end to this, but aren't on board with one state.
And if you have trouble understanding what's going on, hey, welcome to the club. And our task here is to try to distinguish through the smoke and the murk what actually is happening. As Rosa Luxemburg said, the most revolutionary thing you can do is to say clearly what is actually happening.
What I was referring to is, by the way, one state in Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. I was a little cryptic in that regard.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 48th week of 2017, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. With thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the blog newsfromneptune.com. If you want to practice intersectionality, I suggest the intersection of Main and Neal Streets in downtown Champaign from 2 to 4 p.m. Tomorrow afternoon. That is Saturday, the 2nd of December, when the local anti-war group AWARE will be demonstrating against the wars that the United States government is promoting around the world. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion our enemies, and a good night to you.